Well, there are times in our lives when maybe lucky may not be the word that would describe how we're feeling. Have you ever gone through a time in your life when it was hard just to get out of bed in the morning? Those times when all that you had worked for or expected out of life seemed to come crashing down? Times when you'd question your faith and the very existence of God? Was that today for you? Looking back, I can see that there were times, different times in my life, when that would describe my outlook. Tired, frustrated, angry, disappointed, uncertain, confused, even afraid of what might be coming next. And in the story of Job, Job seemed to have the dream life: the fancy home, the gorgeous wife, Ivy League kids, vast property, all the toys money could buy, a seemingly endless source of revenue that could get him the best of everything. He was described as a good man, a decent man. And as the story goes, God and Satan got chatting one day over a table at Williams, and Satan says to God that Job is only such a good, decent guy because he's got everything he could possibly want and more. What kind of a decent guy would he remain if he had all of that taken away from him? And so God is so confident in Job's faithfulness that he says to Satan, "Hit him with your best shot, buddy." And so the story goes that Job lost everything: his wealth, his land, his homes, his children, and even succumbs to painful boils all over his body. And he's reduced to sitting in a pool of ashes, listening to his wife saying, "I told you so. You still believe in a God who would do this to you?" And Job's friends gather around him and they try to figure out where everything went wrong. Why would this be happening to a decent stand-up guy like Job? We've got to figure this out, guys. And even after a week of debating and discussing, they still can't figure it out. And Job goes on to confront God with his litany of accusations and complaints. And God's response is to remind Job of who he is questioning. And he rhymes off all the great things God has done from the very beginning of time. And who is he to question his life and what is happening now? God leaves Job speechless, and Job thinks, "I've been talking way too much. I need to be quiet. I need to listen." Thomas Moore, a former monk and author of Care of the Soul, describes religion as a path of silence, the route to a quiet place, beyond the realm of success and failure, where the voice of all things can be heard and life can be restored. According to Rob Bell, a pastor and writer of contemporary Christian teachings, in his video Pneuma, titled "Whirlwind," we all want answers as to why we suffer. But the only healthy, honest human thing to do when bad things happen to us for no apparent reason is to shout our anger and questions to God and demand an explanation. It makes me think of the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel all night until at dawn, when he finally received the blessing that he had been demanding. The way Rob Bell describes it, the blessing is that anyone's suffering might be released from having to understand it all, but rather be open to the new perspective the circumstances bring to your life. He says, "May you have the wisdom to listen in a time of suffering, instead of doing all the talking and demanding." Thomas More also wrote that the ultimate question of Job is, why do the innocent suffer? As a counselor, he listened to numerous clients ask him throughout the years the same question over and over in a variety of circumstances, be it divorce or death, cancer, attempted suicide, depression. Why is this happening to me? They believed if they could understand the why, then their suffering would end or at least be more bearable. He wrote, if only they could understand, if only they could pinpoint a cause, if only they could place the blame, then they could get on with life. If suffering made sense, then they believed that they could bear it and get on with their lives. The more important challenge Moore recognized was not how to make sense of suffering, but how to live when life is empty, wounded, or miserable. Rob Bell met a man one day whose unborn child was in danger of not surviving to full term. And Rob walked closer to the man and they talked, and he said he could give him no easy answers. But he did tell him that he could avoid people who will try to comfort him by quoting scriptures like Romans 8:28, which we heard read by Noreen this morning. And the verse goes, and we know that all things work together for good for them that love God. I have it in my office. I quote it quite frequently. But from Rob's perspective, and I have to agree with him on this one, by telling him his loss was somehow part of God's mysterious will, well, he just can't swallow that. Anyone who quotes from Romans and says it's all part of a plan, says Rob, they can't walk with you. He told the man to look for people who will be present with him and offer him solidarity, not solutions. I think Rob Bell was directly challenging the understanding that some people held that when something bad happens to you, it's because somehow you deserved it. In ancient biblical times, that was the understanding. And the organized religions over the years made use of that belief to control and sometimes manipulate the masses into doing what they wanted. But Jesus had a very different approach. He was constantly challenging such rigid understanding and always argued on the side of justice and compassion and love. To suggest that a person's illness or misfortune was related to some cosmic balance sheet was not how Jesus understood faith in God. In the 40th chapter of Job, and let me tell you, his suffering went on for a very long time. In the 40th chapter of Job, God does speak to Job directly, and it says, from the eye of the storm. It's a little line, it could easily be missed, but I think that it is significant. God speaks to Job in the eye of the storm, in the midst of the chaos, in the middle of the whirlwind. And God says to Job, stop asking questions and listen. It's not that he made everything right at that moment, restored the calm, and made Job immediately more comfortable. Rather, he instructed Job to stop complaining and listen. I know that it is really hard to listen when you're in pain and scared. But I think that sometimes that's exactly what we need to do. We can rant and throw things and demand answers and exhaust ourselves in tears and wailing, but ultimately we have to stop, take a breath, wipe our tears, and listen. Listen to what the Spirit is telling us about our lives and trust that life can be restored once again. I was going to tell you a story about my first marriage, when it ended, and the fact that I had this friend who came, and it just so happened that she had a similar experience. She had children that were almost my age, but she was also going through a divorce. And the two of us were inseparable for that year of grieving and crying and trying to figure out what happened to our lives. They were not as we had expected them. And it seemed that every other person we met was happily married and happily in a couple, and we were the only two on the entire planet that were going through this awful time. But looking back, we both realized what a gift it was that we were both experiencing that at the exact same time. She actually ended up standing with me when I was ordained with my two children, because I really couldn't have done it without her care and support throughout those very difficult months. She was even the one who introduced me to her sister, who would rent out part of her house to a student And as I was going back to school at the time, not only did she take a student, but she took a student with 2 children still in diapers. That was pretty impressive. I actually ended up living with her for 4 years until I finished my degree. It seemed to me that as the years went on, we kept in touch, and I was happy to say that I ended up marrying her and her new husband, and they've been together for probably over 15 years now. Her husband had been a widower, and they found a new life together. And they've retired out in BC now to be close to their adult children and grandchildren. There was renewal after that time of pain and suffering and new life. In the midst of the whirlwind of my life at that time, God spoke to me of friendship and care and kindness and generosity and new beginnings, and despite the initial pain and heartache, I felt blessed. And when I look back at it, I realize that over the last 24 years of ministry, because I had that experience, it has helped me tremendously to better understand others' pain and suffering. Sci-fi author Spider Robinson wrote in his series, The Callahan Chronicles, "Shared pain is lessened. Shared joy is increased." Yes, Job suffered. But in the midst of his suffering, he had friends who stood with him, and Job describes himself as being completely in the dark. He says to his friends, "I'm not letting up. I'm standing my ground. My complaint is legitimate. God has no right to treat me like this. It isn't fair." How often have we said that or heard that, particularly in the mouths of our children? It isn't fair. Job says, "If I knew where on earth to find him, I'd go straight to him. I'd lay my case before him face to face and give him all my arguments firsthand." We've all done it. "I travel east looking for him. I find no one. And then the west, but not a trace. I go north, but he's hidden his tracks. And then south, not even a glimpse." What a contrast it is to Psalm 139 that says, "Everywhere I look, God is there." When we're in those dark moments, God does not seem to exist. There is no doubt that Job's suffering had put him in a dark place. But my favorite author, Barbara Brown Taylor, writes, "The cloud and the glory go together." That whirlwind, that dark place, the cloud and the glory go together. Not just then, but always. It's the truth about God that few are eager to embrace. Ask Job, who yelled into the darkness for 37 whole chapters before God snatched him up into a whirlwind and showed him things too wonderful for him to take in. Barbara writes, "It's not a popular truth, but there it is. God dwells in deep darkness. The darkness that is not dark to God can be terrifying for those who, like our deities, well lit. God is light. God can't be in the dark." But when we cannot see, when we are not sure where we are going, and all our old landmarks have vanished inside the cloud, that darkness, then plenty of us can believe we are lost when the exact opposite might be true. Based on the witness of those who have gone before, the dark cloud is where God takes people apart so they can be made new. It is the cloud of unknowing where nothing you thought you knew about God can prepare you to meet the God who is. And I love this line. She's such a gifted writer. "It is the dark womb where life begins again, at least for those who are willing to lift the veil, to listen. It is the dark womb where life begins again." Suffering and pain are not planned events in our lives, manipulated by God to test us or teach us. As human beings, we are all vulnerable to suffering and pain. But in the midst of that pain and suffering, we are not alone. And if we listen, God does have something to say to us. And it's not about all the things the world around us teaches about success and failure, about deserving or undeserving. It's about life in its fullness, in its wonder, even in its brokenness. It's about a creative being of whom we were made and who lives in us and through us and loves us and shares every moment of our lives. And as Job experienced God's presence that silenced his words but restored his life, so too are we humbled by God's grace and love and ready to be born again, even out of the darkest times, even in the midst of the dark womb. And we do not bear that burden alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.